You know what? Maybe I appreciate the keto paradigm a lot more as I'm seeing people gravitate towards stricter and stricter versions of it where you're just kicking out plant foods altogether. It's almost like, the carnivore diet makes keto look like a form of paleo or something like that. Keto is an option, but not necessarily a universal solution.
I love it.
Flexible dieting views foods and dieting as sort of a grayscale rather than an all or nothing, black or white type of endeavor that sort of dovetails people into perfectionism. I think people are missing the forest for the trees when they're nitpicking over, oh gosh, when do I need to stop eating in the day? Or, oh gosh, when do I need to start eating in the day? I think that's all just kind of ridiculous. Try to ignore fad diets. Try to find a training program you enjoy and try to find a dietary routine where you enjoy the meals.
I agree. Alan, thank you for coming on, brother. Appreciate it.
Dude, I am so stoked to be here. This is a really long time coming. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Absolutely, man. I remember the first time I think we met probably back in 2012, 2013, probably at like a ISSN or some type of conference or something. And since then, like you said, our paths have just intertwined over the last decade. That I just think it's been a long time coming to just chat and kind of catch up on some topics. I think you're a wealth of knowledge, and I have the utmost respect for you and everything that you do.
I really appreciate that, Ryan. Yes, and indeed it has.
Absolutely. So let's talk. I'm curious because I remember seeing you talk and kind of do this debate, so to speak, with Jeff Volek back in 2013 on keto, and I think you brought some great points up that I'm just curious that since that time, it's been what 10 years. Has your position changed at all, or is there anything new that you've scoured the research and you're like, nope, I still am pretty firm on my position?
Well, it's really funny because you're talking about something that happened, I think, almost exactly 10 years ago when I debated Jeff Volek at the NSCA conference. Um, there's been a bunch of research that came out since then, and I guess it more solidified my position that um, keto is an option, but not necessarily a universal solution. And so when we look at the sort of the two different tracks, the two different goals for keto, you have more of the body composition oriented goal that's, well, weight loss and fat loss. And then we have the athletic performance goal. So I think that keto performs better for the weight loss and fat loss goal than it does for the athletic performance goal, where it kind of varies in its capacity to augment that track. So it hasn't really changed a whole lot. You know what? Maybe I appreciate sort of the keto paradigm a lot more as I'm seeing people gravitate towards stricter and stricter versions of it where you're just, for example, kicking out plant foods altogether. It's almost like, the carnivore diet makes keto look like a form of paleo or something like that.
Right, right.
and and there is a lot of research that's come out. There's a recent study, semi-recent study that Jeff Volek was the corresponding author of, where they tested keto on one arm, and then I believe there was a control arm as well as a keto plus exogenous ketones arm.
Hmm.
And, very tightly controlled study. I believe they did provide the intake for the subjects, and it was a relatively short study, but you know how it is. You can't have super tight control and super long duration all at the same time and stuff. So, but in any case, there was no significant difference in fat loss between the groups because they equated protein, equated calories, and I was surprised to see that Jeff Volek was on there. And this is something that I kind of nailed him on during the debate because he was bringing up research where keto outperformed non-keto for I believe it was fat loss as well as lean body mass gains. And I said, okay, well, was protein equated in this study? And he kind of broke a slight sweat, and but at least he was honest, and he said, no, 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 we didn't equate protein. I'm like, there you go. And so yeah, to answer your question a little more directly, my stance hasn't really changed, but I do want to emphasize that I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with keto. I think it's one of many roads to Rome that are available for people according to personal preference and tolerance and goals.
For sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think this is where a lot of people on the outside of research, there's so much you can do inside of a research, metabolic ward studies, and then there's like practical application.
Mhm.
And so in some world, it's like, well, people who tend to eat more lower carb tend to select out higher protein foods, maybe automatically, which is why a lot of these studies are hard to control because in real world practical application, maybe they are eating a little bit more protein. And to your point, maybe that's part of what's driving that response because when you equate, maybe there is no difference. So it's kind of like in a lab versus practical application. That's the beauty of breaking down these studies and realizing how they differ from real world practical application, yet still apply. Right?
Yeah,
Super
yeah,
interesting.
and I think that keto as an ad libitum prescription is pretty elegant, and it tends to outperform the comparator. You know, when
Right.
you ad libitumize the whole thing, and of course there is, for one reason or another, reports of the general, I guess, well, general population, but the populations used in the studies having, for one reason or another, having a tough time sustaining keto, like by the 12-month mark. There tends to be this up creep in carbohydrate intake, whether it's just a lack of motivation on the part of the subjects, or whether it's difficulty of adherence. But the more I think about it, it's like I know a lot of people who have been keto for like years and decades, and it's honestly, it's not that grueling to maintain 50 grams of carbs or less a day because there's so many options and so many ways to do it. But
Right.
for some odd reason, you see in the literature that people end up doubling their carbohydrate intake, sometimes tripling it compared to the original assignment at baseline. And so that's something that needs to be mentioned as well. It's almost like if you don't have the intent and you don't have the original motivation, and you're just sort of assigned to keto, you may or may not be sustaining it for the long term.
And that's a great point. And I think the meta-analyses and studies like the Yancey study, I think in the early 2000s, they compare keto, more of a low carb keto approach to low fat. Though they see greater adherence in the low carb keto condition long term, it still fades off. And I think that goes to most
Sure.
diets, whether even, and we'll jump into calorie restriction in general. Like
Yeah,
for most people, that's not sustainable either. So it's like you
sure.
have to, and I know something you talk a lot about flexible dieting and incorporating in different periods of maybe a surplus versus a deficit and how important that is. But I think that's just in general for most things. Long term, people, unless you're like these hardcore, like you mentioned, the carnivore people, those people probably will never touch a piece of broccoli for the rest of their lives. but but other than that, I don't know anyone that intense.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that, man. I do agree with it. And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff that can be discussed surrounding keto and carnivore. There's this raging battle going on between like the mainstream, in quotes, or the consensus lipidologists, I guess we can call them,
Mhm.
and the carnivore factions. And so they're arguing over blood lipid fractions. They're arguing over LDL or Is LDL, does
Yep.
LDL matter now that we've got this focus on ApoB? And I almost I almost like to just stay out of that and just watch them argue over it, because they're um, still seemingly trying to figure it out. I mean, there's a couple consensus statements out that put ApoB up at the top recently, but I'm almost waiting for something to shift within the next, I don't know, few years or so. It's such a
For
quickly
sure.
evolving discipline, and like I said, they still seem to be trying to figure it out. Um, so yeah, that's the clinical side of the keto and carnivore discussion. But all of that is clouded by the fact that, I mean, if somebody gets on a plan that's not the standard Western diet, then almost every time they're doing something better, right? They're just better off in some way.
I agree. I agree. I want to jump into intermittent fasting because I saw you and Brad wrote a thorough review on intermittent fasting, and you brought up some great points. One that I think intermittent fasting decreases energy intake. So that's probably in response. Maybe there's nothing magical, so to speak, about intermittent fasting other than it's creating a caloric deficit. And that two, you brought up the fact that I think is super important. When you narrow a window too small, you're prone for muscle loss, right? And I think some people are on this one meal a day kick, and that might be occasion. That might be great, maybe one day here and there, but consistently it's hard to get your protein intake in. So, what was some of your takeaways from that review?
The body of intermittent fasting research is really interesting, and it really kind of challenges long held beliefs about meal frequency, meal distribution through the day and through the week. Um, maybe a couple of the overarching findings are that, um, number one, all of the intermittent fasting variants kind of collectively are on par with daily caloric restriction in terms of their ability to cause fat loss and weight loss. So we can almost look at the IF variants here in one corner and conventional dieting as on a level playing field for the goal of weight loss, goal of fat loss. And so that's been a boon for intermittent fasting proponents. Okay, but of course, it's disappointing to hear that for people who wanted to hear that. Okay, well, intermittent fasting is superior to daily caloric restriction. So we're generally just not seeing that. We're seeing that it's on par. So that's actually a good thing from the standpoint of being able to have options, and from a practitioner standpoint, let's say being able to individualize programs for folks who prefer a nonlinear dieting pattern versus this regular daily linear caloric restriction. And so it's actually been a really good thing. It's been kind of a breakthrough to see that intermittent fasting works just as well as daily caloric restriction. And the beauty of uh, the beauty of some of the intermittent fasting variants, well, actually all of them, is that they work just as well as daily caloric restriction on an ad libitum basis. And so you don't have to have these specific quantitative prescriptions in intermittent fasting. You can just, for the feeding phases, just sort of eat unrestrictedly. And for the fasting phases, well, obviously you're fasting. But it ends up affording the dieter less, I guess, micromanagement and quantitative focus. And that can be, for some people, less fatiguing than making sure you get that nice little 500 calorie deficit in every day. Otherwise, you're going to fail, type of thing. And so
Right.
um, now, across the variants of intermittent fasting, every other day fasting seems to be the
Mhm.
one that compromises lean body mass the most, naturally, because maybe the deficit is a little bit more aggressive overall than something like time restricted eating, where you give yourself typically a 6 to 9 hour window to eat each day, and then you're fasting outside of that. Um, Time restricted eating combined with resistance training has an interesting body of literature there, mainly spearheaded by Grant Tinsley and his group. Morrow as well. I think she's in the group as well. Um, there are some cool things happening with that time restricted eating. Well, the thing with that is just there's very little studies. There's very few studies in that direction, but all of them are showing equal preservation of lean body mass, but superior fat loss to the conventional feeding window when there's this time restricted eating plus resistance training combined. And so, it's been interesting keeping an eye on that. But of course, all of these things are population specific. So if somebody is into bodybuilding, they want to gain muscle mass. They want to, walk around like they want to take up the whole hallway when they walk, and they want to turn sideways when they go through a doorway type of thing. I wouldn't I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily recommend any of the intermittent fasting variants. I would just have them kind of pony up and do all of the theoretical things within reason that maximize net muscle protein gains through the course of the day and the week. And that does not involve fasting periods, which are just inherently compromising to muscle protein synthesis and anabolic signaling and all these processes that dovetail towards gaining muscle mass.
Right. And I think you bring up some fantastic points. What are your thoughts? Because I think ultimately it comes down to sustainability. Like, yet caloric restriction works. Obviously, we know that. When match or when you compare it to intermittent fasting, the data on weight loss at least seems to be the same. Some of the new research is showing that intermittent fasting is more sustainable for people than chronic caloric restriction out just kind of ad lib. Would that be more of a win for intermittent fasting for sustainability than if people can sustain it in that intermittent fasting window, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, and I think that the individualization of that prescription is really important, because everybody's going to kind of respond differently to these things, especially in the long term. Um, one of the aspects of intermittent fasting prescriptions that has kind of annoyed me is this push for a very specific timing of the feeding window in the day. So
Mm.
there's one camp who's been pushing for early time restricted feeding. And maybe that one is more prevalent in the literature. And previous to that, in the, I guess, in the trenches, Martin Burkin was probably, and guys like Ori Hofmeckler, and I'm not sure what Brad Pilon was on. Maybe he was more on the periodic, like 1 or 2 day fasting type of thing. But like within day fasting, uh, there typically is a camp that advocates for eating later in the day, and then the other camp advocates for eating earlier in the day. Now, per the evidence, there's a little more evidence to eat earlier in the day if you're looking at these semi relevant clinical markers, usually centering
Right.
around glucose control, insulin sensitivity. But that there's a study that came out by Liu and colleagues who compared a early time restricted feeding model, which the subjects ate from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., with a conventional 12-hour eating model where the subjects spread their eating window from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And so these advantages that have been seen in the short term research with glucose control, better glucose control in the early time restricted feeding models, it just kind of disappeared over the long term. And so this casts some doubt upon the previous beliefs that, hey, we need to stop eating at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And so,
Right.
um,
Right.
And I always thought that that was kind of silly anyway, because I think that some people will better be able to sustain their plans on a late shifted eating pattern, while others will better be able to sustain their stuff on an earlier shifted eating pattern. So I ultimately think that is an immaterial programming element as far as it having to be universalized in one way or another. It's just,
Right.
yeah, I think people are missing the forest for the trees when they're nitpicking over, oh gosh, do I need to stop eating in the day? Or, oh gosh, when do I need to start eating in the day? I think that's all just kind of ridiculous. And another point I want to make about intermittent fasting. You mentioned at the beginning that one of its big benefits is the facilitation of lower total caloric intake. And that's really kind of the magic behind intermittent fasting, but it's also one of the detriments, particularly in lean subjects. So I think the author's name was Templeton, who who compared alternate day fasting versus daily caloric restriction, but this was in lean men, and so there was greater lean body mass loss on the IF program versus the daily caloric restriction arm, and they supposedly matched caloric intake, but for some odd reason, there was a negative effect in lean body mass wise when lean people start doing IF. So IF is only as good as it's helping somebody maintain a healthy body weight or lose body weight if they started off from a state of overweight or obesity. And kind of the leaner you get, the more risky that IF can be.
Right. And I think building off of that, also the lower the window that you have, the more prone you are for lean body mass loss. So like some studies show like when you start to get under 6 hours and under 4 hours and you're doing one meal a day, it's very, very difficult to get in your protein intake in one meal, and probably
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
ideal. So,
Yeah.
so it's
Mm-hmm.
like that when you have this, there seems to be this sweet spot, maybe 8 to 12 hours. That like if your goal is both lean mass and maybe caloric intake, fat loss, maybe that seems to be the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And I 100% agree on like I think there needs to be flexibility within a window if you are going to be intermittent fasting. I don't think it needs to be super rigid. There are some studies that are coming out now in terms of the masses where they're looking at most people. There's about 15% of calories that people consume on average come after 9 p.m. and 100% of people 100% of calories are met by 6:30. So I guess for most people, I guess you could fall within that realm of, hey, that's probably when most people are finishing up dinner, and then people are, later on they're watching Netflix or something. That's when they're eating kind of all these snacks that are probably higher in carbohydrate, lower in protein, and that's what's adding on additional calories above what they need to sustain themselves, right? So maybe there's some help in there, and
Yeah.
intermittent fasting kind of helps control that. And that's kind of what we're seeing with that caloric intake, right? Controlling that. Um,
Yes.
and
Yep.
then, what are your thoughts on? So that's with weight loss and fat loss. Dr. Sachin Panda is doing some work in animals right now, obviously, but still interesting. Matching calories between a calorie restricted diet and intermittent fasting, more on the eating window, not the alternative day, more like condensing the eating window. And the sees very promising. I think it was a 30% increase in some of these markers of longevity and how long these mice lived. Do you think there's anything there? Even when calories are matched, he's seeing that.
I think there could be something there, but it's really limited to actually maybe being detectable in sedentary humans. If we transfer it to humans, in sedentary humans who are either overweight or obese. And so I see the benefits, both measurable and theoretical. I see them diminishing the further somebody gets in terms of their fitness and their ideal body composition.
Mm.
So with physical activity, with an exercise training program, and favorable body composition, low, moderate body fat, and adequate muscle mass and strength. I think that intermittent fasting just sort of becomes far more of a way to just stick to a plan rather than it having inherent health benefits or longevity benefits. So I'm just really skeptical about that once you've gotten the big rocks straight with exercise and body composition.
Now, talk to me a little bit about what your plan, like just in a typical week, maybe. Like, what's your eating window look like? Do you kind of just eat freely, and then like how many meals do you have compared to snacks? What does that look like?
I probably eat on average about four times in a day. Um, I have a late shifted pattern. I'm kind of a vampire type of night owl type of person. And here's the thing: I don't want to be. So you're touching upon one of the things in my life that I haven't been able to conquer. So it's really easy and natural for me to stay up till like 2, um, and 3. I'm like, it's like,
Yeah.
and it's really I have to be in a conference type of schedule to actually be up in the morning. It's like, man, yeah, I got to be on stage and I got to be fully awake. Therefore, I do have to set my alarm for whatever it might be, like 7, 6, 8 o'clock a.m.
Yeah.
The times that even God's not awake yet. And so yeah, but with that, deep dark secret out of the way, I eat about 4 times a day, and it's pretty kind of standard. I try to hit like 40, at least 40 grams of protein per meal, and it's pretty standard. It's sort of standard, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, pre-bed snack. And my goals are to gain a little bit more muscle, lose a little bit more body fat. And I'm giving myself like I don't know, like a few year window to achieve that. I want to. It's really odd. I mean, when people hit their glory days, they hit their peak at a certain age, and then they're at an older age, and they look back at their pictures, and they're posting on Instagram their pictures of their glory days and stuff like that. Yes, I think that's cool. That it's cool, and there's a certain beauty and charm about that. But that would kind of depress me a little bit, man. Kind
Yeah.
of like,
Yeah.
I want to sort of pace myself. I don't want to. I don't want to peak just yet. So then, the latter part of my life will be me posting pictures of myself on Instagram when I look freaking awesome. I want to. I just want to spread that shit out a bit more. So
Yep.
I'm pacing
I get
myself.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
I get it. I love it. Talk to me a little bit about flexible dieting. Like, what does that mean for someone who's kind of heard the term but doesn't really understand it? What does that truly mean? Like, how would you define that?
Flexible dieting, per the literature, is a cognitive style of dietary restraint. So it's typically, especially within, in quotes, the culture, the fitness culture, people equate flexible dieting with counting macros, when that's just actually it's inaccurate. It has its roots in psychology research where they're comparing rigid restraint versus flexible restraint. And so that this kind of evolved into this study of rigid dietary control versus flexible dietary control. So when you think of counting macros, you're looking at a high degree of precision, and aside from food selection, you kind of don't have a whole lot of freedom. So in an odd sense, you can almost think of keto, for example. keto is almost like a more flexible paradigm than counting macros. So,
Right.
so yeah, flexible dieting should be distinguished from counting macros, just in principle, because it flexible dieting views foods and dieting as sort of a gray scale rather than an all or nothing, black or white type of endeavor where that sort of dovetails people into perfectionism. And so the literature on flexible dieting, um, very consistently over the past couple decades or so, showed that a non-dichotomous mindset it led to superior outcomes both for body weight regulation as well as staving off the ravages of eating disorders and sort of like staving off
Mm.
unhealthy psychological states and unhealthy relationships with food. So being able to view foods and dieting as a gray scale and saying that, okay, well, I don't have to eat perfectly. I don't have to nail everything on the gram. I don't have to stick with just the six foods that work. Flexibility, it applies to many different programming elements, all the way from macronutrient composition to the hedonic approach. Like how am I going to approach indulgence meals or in quotes cheat meals versus cheat days and stuff.
Mm.
Flexible dieting is really a matter of individualizing the approach. So whereas some people want to track every little detail, other folks would go crazy um, trying to do that. They would hate it and they would be able to sustain it for like a week and they would quit. So,
Right.
flexible dieting, as much as it does apply to a cognitive style of dietary restraint, it also applies to flexibility of the dietary approach. Is somebody more quantitative or is somebody more qualitative and habits based? And so those things can all be individualized down to what we were just talking about, the linearity of the diet. Is somebody more prone to
Mm.
just kind of keeping that same routine or that same, let's say, deficit daily, or do they kind of prefer to have a more cyclical type of diet? And people differ in their preference for that and their ability to sustain those things, and that can all be individualized. So flexible dieting is really individualizing the approach.
I love it. And I think across the board, no matter how someone chooses to eat, there needs to be, it doesn't often happen, but there needs to be like this behavioral science lens that we look through and say, let's look at the individual and see what's going to allow them to sustain this. And I think that's a kind of a core of what you're talking about in terms of flexible dieting is like what from a behavioral standpoint, how do we work with this individual in order to help them accomplish their goals? What are there like parameters around that? Are there staples where it's like, hey, we're going to focus on protein first to make sure because we know protein satiating and we know we need to try and make sure they're eating at least a good quality source of protein with each meal. How do you kind of construct maybe in simple terms for someone to construct their own flexible diet, so to speak?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Ryan, it's more like starting off really granular and high resolution and graduating
Yeah.
further and further back towards the big picture, the
Mhm.
you know the view from the drone and then the view
Mhm.
from the satellite. So it's like, I think it really does help a lot of people, not everybody, but it does help a lot of people, especially in the fitness sphere. Helps them to know the gram and calorie values of the various foods that they prefer and they can build a good routine around. So it'll help people to gain that awareness, just so they can know objectively about about how many calories is required for me to maintain my current body weight and body composition at this particular activity level. I think that's useful information. And I do think that for a lot of people, it can actually help to track everything that they eat for 2 to 4 weeks. To give people this kind of objective idea of what's maintaining them. Um, but beyond that, I do think that for the majority of the population, it's important to wean off of that level of micromanagement because I think only a minority of the population would actually enjoy that and would actually feel like their lives are being enriched by plugging their macros in to an app. And I do know people who enjoy that, and I do know people who have it so ingrained in their routine and they don't mind it. But I also know a lot of
Right.
people who really hate that and they can only stand it for a couple weeks. Okay, so once that knowledge is in place, then you can graduate towards, okay, let's forget about calories and protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and let's just go with tracking protein and total calories, and leave this sort of flexible margin for carbohydrate and fat. Okay, cool, great. Now from that point, you can graduate towards just having a ballpark idea of whether you're getting enough protein through the course of the day and whether your meals are looking like they should in terms of food selection and across the groups, and just variety and balance, and whether or not you're getting a sound and healthy intake of different types of foods. And from that point, it's like, okay, well, you can be flexible with pretty much everything because you already have gone through this sort of psychological boot camp training, this awareness training where you know what a healthy diet looks like for you personally, and you know how to maintain that routine. And so once you know these things, then you can focus on what are your favorite meals for a given time of day. What are your favorite meals for the given meal, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or if you're somebody like me, breakfast, lunch, dinner, late snack. Um, just find the meals that you like most for those slots, and just lock in and just keep doing that and keep it. You don't have to obsessively keep everything tightly controlled, but once you find meals that you like, it's really not a matter of putting up with the diet. It's a matter of enjoying the diet. And then you can just adjust the surrounding variables from there if you want to change body composition. If you want to lose fat, if you want to gain muscle, or whatever, just keep that diet in place that you really like and enjoy, and adjust training variables. And so that's kind of one way to look at it, where you wean off of tracking every little detail to more like just ballparking it and having an idea and having been locked into a routine that you enjoy. And so I would encourage everyone to just find out what are their favorite breakfasts, what's your favorite lunch, what's your favorite dinner, what's your favorite snack, and then you can just simply maintain that and adjust the other variables according to how your goals may evolve over time.
And now, will you take, like, for example, I love pancakes, right? But obviously, that's not going to have enough protein kind of to optimize my goals at breakfast. Would then you say, you know what, keep the pancakes, maybe let's just add in a protein shake on top of that, versus completely changing the meal? Maybe it's, hey, keep your pancakes, but maybe let's just supplement with a 20, 30, 40 gram protein shake on top of that.
Yes, that's one of the ways to do it. It's honestly that's
Okay.
one of the ways to do it. Uh, the example of pancakes kind of worries me for most of the population, but no, I see your point. And I personally use protein powder as a tool, or as even like a cheat code to getting to hitting my requirements. It's like this. I've got a blender
I
right
love
here
it.
with the protein shake going, and it is a beautiful thing. Um, and thankfully, I don't have these types of food restrictions that keep me off of eating things like eggs and meat and stuff like that. So it's really not
Right.
a problem hitting the numbers. But yeah, protein powder is definitely a cheat code. And in the conversation about what constitutes a healthy diet, there's just a lot of variation in there that you can
Sure.
apply to individuals. Um, the model for an unhealthy diet, well, which has been proven, is sort of the standard Western type of pattern.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of variety that people can maintain and still live a right, long, healthy life, and it really does kind of boil down to whether you're maintaining a certain degree of physical activity and a certain favorable body composition.
I love it. We could talk about that all day of how to truly, like, we call it engineering this ultimate human blueprint, but I think these are great steps for people to take. Like, you have to get started somewhere, right? Create a foundation, and then you can refine as time goes on. I want to get into seed oils because I think that's a
Yeah.
topic, but
Okay.
that's super popular right now. One question I have before that, and I think this will kind of lead into that because the data on seed oils is a little bit all over the place right now. But I, from a scientist perspective, there's this concept of evidence in terms of what has the most power, right? And oftentimes people
Mhm.
look at these meta-analyses as being like, hey, meta-analyses and these thorough reviews have the most power. Some arguments are there's pros and cons against these things because sometimes when there's trash in, you get trash out,
Yeah.
meaning
Yeah.
not all studies can be looked at the same, right? So,
Yeah.
what would be your thought on that in terms of, hey, meta analyses? A lot of times people look at them and make a lot of conclusions from them, but that's really saying that all studies are the same
Yeah.
that are inputted into that meta analysis, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. This sort of meta analyses they can be a double edged sword because I mean you're attempting to draw a singular conclusion from a variety of designs and a variety of protocols, and you're basically you're almost you're cornered into overgeneralizing, and so
For sure.
I think that meta analyses, the conclusions of them, there's almost the tyranny of the majority going on.
Right.
So they're only as meta analyses really they're only as good as the quality of the studies they contain. And if there's
Right.
one or two really bad apples in there with, let's say, really large effects, they could they could skew the whole the results of the meta analysis. And so I still think it's useful to be able to get an aerial view of what we're seeing, but I also think it's important to be critical of even the almighty systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I think it's important to be critical of them, and it's important to, I guess, to know which of the key trials in there hold more weight because of superior methodology than the others.
For sure.
So, so yeah, definitely a good point to bring out. You can't just simply regard a given meta-analysis as the gospel because hey, we pulled all the data together, this is what we found. So like
Right. I think it's important. Yeah.
there's examples with that in, for example, the low carb versus high carb literature. There's a lot of meta-analyses that call anything lower than 45% carbohydrate low carb. And so you look at
Right.
the results of the meta. Yeah, we didn't find anything at all. So, yeah, freaking,
Right.
of course. Like, what kind of differences are you gonna find between like 55% carbohydrates and 44% carbohydrates in a diet? It's like, oh man. So yeah, all this stuff does have to be looked at critically.
Super important. And I think you do an incredible job breaking that down. And it's hard for the masses to see that, right? Because I'll give you a perfect example. There's been meta-analyses written on topics that we've even done research on. The challenge is studies are not equivocal. Like Dr. William Kramer, one of the best scientists in the world, did a study where he did this super hard training method. We duplicate that model, do a super hard training method, and then someone else does a model where they do like we're doing deadlifts, squats, bench press, and someone else does it, and it could be supplement or any type of intervention, and they do a leg extension model. All of
Hmm.
those studies get thrown into a meta-analysis. Like, well, maybe nothing's really going on. Those studies are very different, right?
Yeah.
Vastly different in terms of what they're doing and how
Hmm.
they're doing it,
Hmm.
and really who they. Most people aren't doing deadlifts and squats and bench press, but there's a good chunk of people who are. A knee extension model probably you can't really compare that, right? Super
Right.
tough,
Right. Right.
super tough.
Yeah. It's like
So
it reminds me of the limitations of a meta-analysis that my buddies and I did on nutrient timing. So on the anabolic window concept. And of the
yep.
13 studies in the meta-analysis, only 5 of the studies matched protein or equated protein, whereas the other 8 studies just simply added protein for that, that within the anabolic window application of protein. And so there's a limited amount of literature looking at protein equated conditions where you're genuinely looking at the timing effects of protein rather than additive effects. And so there's little things like that it helps to know about the limitations of the literature. And as this applies to the concept of seed oils,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same the same caveats apply. I think that there's this tendency to overgeneralize when people form their opinions or statements about seed oils. Like it's very common in social media comment sections, for example, for somebody to chime in and say seed oils are bad. There's no way I would eat that stuff. That's it's like, well, first of all, why and which seed oils? Would you say the same thing with meat and dairy? Because that's exactly what you're saying. You're saying dairy is bad. I all of dairy is bad. I would never eat that stuff. Meat is bad. I would never eat that stuff. Okay, that's an overgeneralization. What dairy food are you talking about? What dose? What type of meat are you talking about? What dose? What form of preparation? What is it? What kind of processing are we looking at? There's so many things that need to be discussed in the seed oil conversation that saying seed oils are bad is literally it's the equivalent of saying dairy's bad. You know? and
Right.
people
Right.
don't like to hear that. It's much easier and it fits much more comfortably in people's ways of organizing things in their mind and seeing the world and figuring things out by saying, oh, yeah, well, seed oils are bad. And okay, well, I'm going to move on with my life. I know that this thing is bad. So it's this sort of this binary view of seed oils, good or bad. When you look at the literature, there's a ton of positive outcomes seen from various seed oils. And sure, there's some negative outcomes seen from like refried oils that are used in diners where people are just reusing oil for various foods, and then you're getting this, you're getting a lot of oxidation products, and you're eating rancid oils, etc. And it's like, okay, so we have to talk about context. We have to talk about the type and the dose and everything else.
I love that, and I think context is key because it's been a super fascinating explosion of seed oils, and everyone's like, people are like boycotting every single seed oil that exists, and I'm curious what the data is that's out there on it, and from what I've seen, it kind of aligns with what you're saying. I think there's a lot of correlational research showing higher levels of seed oil consumption in the last 20 years, higher levels of obesity. Can we say that seed oils is causing that? Absolutely not. There have been studies in China where they've looked at people with seed oil versus animal fat. People who were cooking with seed oils had higher incidence of cardiovascular disease, higher incidence of death. Can we say that seed oil caused that? No. So there's enough to say maybe it's something to look at. The human data, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. The human data is limited. I've only found a handful of ones, and most of them are extra virgin olive oil versus canola oil. And from what I've seen, the canola oil isn't driving more inflammation in these studies, but the extra virgin olive oil is having a benefit, right? So it's not the canola oil isn't causing an issue. It's just that the extra virgin olive oil is having lower levels of interleukin 6, lower levels of these other inflammatory markers compared to canola oil. That's what I've seen. I don't know what you've seen.
Yeah, yeah, no, I've seen that as well. And interestingly, there's a recent meta-analysis showing the superiority of canola oil over olive oil for improving blood lipid profile. So it's this 32 study
Hmm.
meta-analysis showing canola oil actually outperforming olive oil, not in the area of inflammation, but in the area of blood lipids. And
Right.
so that's interesting. Some people will dismiss it and say, "Hey, who cares about LDL and HDL and all that stuff, right?" And so, but the fatty acid composition of canola oil, I mean, actually has more omega 3 than olive oil, and so you would
Hmm.
kind of at least hypothesize, well, hey, that's part of what's going on with the superior effects on blood lipids. But a lot of the seed oil concerns are boiling down to this overly reductionistic view of fatty acid composition, like specifically omega 6, linoleic acid. I don't think that we can look at foods in terms of their just specific fatty acids. I think we have to look at foods as a whole and consider the food matrix. And when people start saying, yeah, omega 6 bad, omega 3 good, well, you're way oversimplifying there. And so that's a lot of the root of the seed oil scare, at least among a little bit more of the well versed and well read types, is they're scared of linoleic acid. But
Right.
once again, looking at the literature, it's like, okay, if you compare linoleic acid rich oils with let's say the saturated fat rich oils, and we look at these comparisons on various effects. They're usually intermediate types of endpoints. They're usually biomarker type endpoints. There's on the whole, the omega 6 rich veg oils and the seed oils are going to outperform things like butter and lard for how they affect blood lipids. And of course, mortality is a shit show to try to study, right? And disease endpoints are
Right.
another shit show because you're following people for years and decades and you're collecting their food frequency questionnaire every 5 years. It's like,
Right.
okay, cool,
Yeah.
and you're trying to statistically adjust after you've collected the data. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to try to make heads or tails over here, but it's like, uh, you just how are you going to how pick your poison? How are you going to die? Are you going to shoulder the oxidation products of the polyunsaturated oils, that you're eating, or are you going to deal with the adverse changes in blood lipids from the butter that you're putting over everything? It's like pick the physiological process or outcome that you want to let your body deal with, and it's almost the same in the end. But because contrary to popular belief, we're all going to die at some point. We're all going to leave the planet at least. Some of us, our souls are going to live on. Some of us won't. But so,
I love it.
and so I think that people are really missing the forest for the trees as far as these things go. It's like, unless you are somebody who is eating at the same diner that's reusing the same soybean and corn oil mix for their fried foods, you're really kind of hard pressed as somebody who's a typical enthusiast in the fitness space who's eating a reasonable diet. You'd be hard pressed to be running into an adverse amount of reused, refried corn and soybean oil. So I'm not really sure what the issue is. Sesame oil, that's a seed oil. I mean, it's been
Right.
consumed in Asia for over 5,000 years. People are cooking with it. People are pouring it over the foods, and they're not necessarily dying off by the millions. Um, Flaxseed oil, that was a big one back in the 2000s. People were chugging it because of all the health benefits that we found from it. Um, and then, another one, canola oil. Canola oil has unanimously favorable effects in the literature, but people are scared because it's processed with hexane. Um, and but when you look at the hexane content of the various oils, there's a lot of other oils that have. There's a lot of non-seed oils that have higher hexane content than canola oil. So when you don't look at the data, it's easy to believe certain things. But that the sheer minuscule amounts of hexane in there compared to what's considered harmful, you would have to drink gallons of these type of oils to ingest enough hexane to cause
Right.
adverse effects. Then we can look at, my point is there's a diversity of biological effects across these seed oils, and there's a diversity of risk potential. We can't just lump them all into one boat. Like I'm not a big fan of the idea of chugging down cottonseed oil and incurring whatever
Mm.
traces of gossipol you can that'll potentially sterilize you if you over time, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the phenomenon of the incoming generations having less and less testosterone. It's like, oh god, that doesn't sound great, like what's going on there. And so yeah, I think it's easy to overgeneralize, Ryan.
Now, do you think that the way any of these oils are processed affect it? So a lot of the research on, at least from what I've seen on canola oil, they're using less refined, right, non-heated
Mhm.
forms of canola oil. Do you think that would have, like to your point, maybe the diner is more common, or compared to the research that's out there showing these benefits on blood markers, they're using maybe a less harsh one.
Yeah, that's hard to say, and a lot of it is speculative. Um,
Sure.
I think that I think ideally, you cold pressed oils, cold pressed stuff
Yeah.
is at least in theory going to be the healthiest. Um, but then again, you're still gonna end up heating it at some point, and
Hmm.
when you compare head to head the effects of these types of oils, heated or not, with high saturated fat animal based oils, they still tend to outperform them as far as the health markers that we're typically looking at. And so
Sure.
I still think that any which way you slice it, you're going to strike some kind of a compromise. Um, and on their own, yeah, you
Right.
can look at veg oils that are high, put through high heat and stuff like that. But okay, like what's the alternative, and what kind of risks are you willing to admit to or incur with the alternatives? And so I think the name of the game
Right.
is to just be somewhat judicious and moderate about these things, and then you'll be fine. Um, a lot of these types of oils are wrapped up into foods that you shouldn't be eating a lot of anyway. They're wrapped up in, they're part of
Mm.
a mix of highly refined and processed type of engineered snack foods and uh, foods that would contribute negatively to the diet quality in the first place.
Last question on seed oils, and then I want to wrap it up and be cognizant of your time. Is there an ideal ratio you'd recommend? Omega, I know some people talk about this ratio. There's some data showing this omega 6 to omega 3 ratio may be important for dementia, cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease. Currently, I think last I've read, the ratio is at 15 to 1,
Mm-hmm.
omega 6 to omega 3. Do you think that that's important at all? And maybe omega 6s are fine if we bump up our omega 3s, or do you think it doesn't really have an impact?
The consensus is moving towards the ratio being unimportant compared to simply getting enough omega 3. And
Mm.
I'll give you an example. It's like the consensus is moving towards looking at the food selection and the food source. So for getting like a ton of omega 6 from, let's say, chugging corn oil is
Mm.
different from getting a bunch of omega 6 from eating a whole lot of nuts per day, right? So there's a
Yeah.
distinct difference there in the vehicle and the packaging of the linoleic acid. So it's more a matter of improving diet quality than looking at the specific fatty acids, than looking um, at linoleic acid in a vacuum. And when you have high diet quality and you get enough omega 3, then the actual ratio doesn't seem to be a material concern. Um, so yeah, that's my thought on it at the moment.
What do you cook with? Do you take any precaution? Like, do you say, "Hey, I'm going to cook with olive oil or an avocado oil," or just like, if you're spraying the pan, it's Pam. Don't really care, or yeah, what do you cook with?
The staple at my house is extra virgin olive oil,
Same. Yep.
and it's I just like the taste of it, and I kind of like traditional stuff. I try to look at history, and I okay, let me just be honest. I friggin' love Italian food.
Same.
And the Italian and Mediterranean food and the whole like Mediterranean model, it's just great. And they're olive oiling everything and they're healthy. And so sometimes success leaves clues, as Jim Rohn would say. But yeah,
Yep.
that's a big staple at my house. And whenever I argue with people online about like seed oils and stuff, and they say, "Well, do you eat seed oils?" And I'm like, "Well, I occasionally eat sesame oil. Do you canola oil? No, well, no. I use olive oil. That doesn't mean that the evidence isn't out there to defend, let's say, canola oil, for example. But I personally like the taste of olive oil, so that's what I use.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you. Last question and then I want to jump into like our final four, just quick hitters.
Okay.
You, in my opinion, are one of the brightest minds in the nutrition space. I know over the last
Thank you.
couple of years, you've gone through some personal trials and tribulations. A huge kudos to you for kind of coming out the other side of that. And I
Thanks,
think
man. Thank you.
for a lot of people, how do you how did you deal with when things came to light and you're being very open, you're a public figure, right?
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
you're open about some of these struggles or challenges and
Hmm.
tribulations, how do you deal with some people that all of a sudden now that you thought were colleagues, friends, people are like trying to dissociate with you and they're like, I'm not a part of him. Oh my gosh, I can't even believe
Yeah.
that. Maybe even stabbing you in the back. How do you deal with that as someone who's a public figure?
Wow. You know what? I mainly deal with it just internally. Um, the passage of time just seems to erase everything. As far as as far as like, being a public figure and having had those trials and tribulations, it's like I use it as an opportunity to talk about changing habits for the better.
Mm, love
Um,
that.
and for the listeners who are unaware, I used to be an alcoholic. I used to have alcohol use disorder. I used to consume a bottle and a half of wine like every day. It's like,
Mm,
and so it hit a point where that just started, nearly ruined my professional life, and my personal life as well. And so the hardest part, really, Ryan, is having lost people I thought were friends. That's a tough part,
sure.
and you end up inevitably resenting these people. It's like, hey, wait a minute. When I took a nice fall, a nice face plant, my friends like kind of checked in and said, hey man, you really screwed up, but hey, how can we help you get help? Whereas
Right.
other folks took the opportunity to get on a pulpit, step on my neck, and you inevitably resent that. And honestly, that's
Right.
probably something I need to see my therapist for, just being able to kind of get past that. But to answer your question more directly, it's very tough to deal with those kinds of losses. It's
Absolutely.
very tough to deal with that, and it's extremely tough to deal with the consequences of actions you don't remember because you were in a blackout state. Like it's
Sure.
the oddest thing, if you've lived long enough to see how people deal with being shit faced. Some people are extremely different people, as being intoxicated, and some people are just kind of the same. And so, like, the behavior that can come out in a blackout state is often the opposite of how you are in a sober state. And so if you're told about, hey, you did X, Y, and Z, and like in my case, it's like I pride myself on being highly self-aware. I pride myself on being extremely respectful to whoever's around me, and I pride myself on making sure that like, people's personal space is respected. And I consider myself to be highly socially intelligent. And
Hmm.
so when you learn of stuff retrospectively told to you that are the exact opposite of what I described, then you go, holy shit, that's insane.
Right.
I can't even relate to that. And so that was an easy decision for me to just, give up one of my favorite things to do, which was to drink the wine and the beer and drink all the things.
Right.
And it turned out to be a really good thing. And it was the silver lining of that was major. But yeah, it's still, to this day, man. It's still, I wish I had certain people in my life who I thought were friends that I've lost. It still hurts.
For sure. Completely understand that, man. And thank you for sharing that. And I think I have the utmost, like I said, utmost respect for you kind of coming through that and coming out the other end. And I think obviously you're a better person because of it, right?
I appreciate that, man.
So
I
huge kudos.
it feels good to hear that. Thank you, Ryan.
Absolutely. All right. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I call this the final
Oh,
four.
okay.
Just quick, rapid, just more personal questions for you, and then we'll wrap this up. First question is, what's your favorite snack and favorite meal?
Anything chocolatey. Favorite snack is
Um,
anything chocolatey. It's like I consider eggs to be a snack. Like a midday snack, I'll have four. soft boiled eggs. I love that.
Nice.
I adore eggs. I read the literature and I see people getting scared. But you know what, dude? Uh, uh, with certain things, you have to know the risk and then take the calculated risk and see what effects are occurring, like biomarker wise and just morphologically. And eggs don't hurt me. If anything, they help me. Um,
Right.
and so my favorite meal. Okay, so yeah, snacks. I love chocolate and eggs. Um,
Love it.
I'm one of these guys, dude. I eat everything that won't eat me first. Okay, so I
Okay.
love it all. I love pasta dishes. I love steak dishes. I love seafood dishes. Um, I do have an inner fat boy for sure, for sure.
Do.
Uh, I had an outer
What?
fat boy at one point, but um, I don't know, man. That's a tough one, Ryan. I'm just going to default to I just kind of like it all as far as the meal stuff goes.
Like it all. I love it.
Yeah,
What
yeah. I
second question, what's your favorite book? Favorite book or something you're currently reading right now?
Oh man, favorite book. Dude, these are questions I was definitely not ready for. Uh,
Or something you're reading that you like.
I'm gonna shamefully admit to you, Ryan, that all I read is PubMed. It's all I read, and
I
it's
love it.
like I'm so unbalanced in that respect. I'm so unbalanced. The last fictional book I read was called The Bronze Bow, and I don't even
Mm,
remember the author's name of that, but I really liked the book.
love it.
Um, I like my own, but okay, and this is going to sound hilarious, but I really do like the book that I just wrote, the book Flexible Dieting that I wrote. I read it back and I go, man, the
I love
editors
it.
did a great
Me
job
too.
cleaning up my points in my language and stuff like that. I mean, it's a hell of a job. So, yeah, maybe that would be it.
I love it. That's your baby, right? You gotta love it.
Yeah,
Gotta
yeah.
love it. I love it. Third question is, what are you most excited about in your life right now?
I just love how my family is healthy and well adjusted, and I love the bright future in front of my two teenage boys.
Love it.
Um, I'm super excited to to see them. Well, actually, one of them's 19, so technically he's a man. One of them's 16,
Mhm.
so and I'm just super excited. I feel super blessed to be married to my Proverbs 31 wife, Jenna. And I guess that's what I'm most excited about. Most excited about my family, and everybody's healthy and everybody's headed in a great direction. So.
That's amazing, man. And last question is, what is one thing that people can do today? They're listening to this podcast. What's one thing they can do to improve their health?
Don't read too many things on the internet. Don't read too many
That's a good.
lay editorials on the internet. Try to avoid fad diets. I mean, if something sounds like it's too good to be true, or if something promises like these just amazingly quick results and it's this brand new discovery that all you have to do is drink this little concoction before bed and it will melt your fat away or whatever. Just ignore that. Try to ignore fad diets. Um, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind, and the second thing that comes to mind is try to find a training program you enjoy and
Mm,
try to find a dietary routine where you enjoy the meals. So people think that enjoying
love that.
each meal is going to make you overeat stuff when a lot of times it's the opposite. If you enjoy each meal, you're actually more satiated by it because you feel like you've fulfilled something. You don't feel like
Right.
you need to make it up elsewhere because you sort of deprived yourself of something that you enjoy eating. And so, yeah, those are the
Great
Those
advice.
are the things. Yeah.
Great advice. And last thing is, where can people find you? Website, social media. Where can they learn more about you and support you?
You can find me at alanaragon.com. And so there you can get access to my research review, which I've been doing since 2008. It's a monthly subscription. And I also have a book that I released a year ago as of 2 days ago. So still a brand new book called
Amazing.
Flexible Dieting. And yeah, those are my two babies, my two projects. This is my research review and the book, and I do have some more stuff in the works, but you can always find it at alanaragon.com.
Amazing, man. Well, thank you so much. This conversation has been tremendous. It's been a long time coming. I'm sure we'll probably have to hop back on when some new trend comes out, and we're going to need to break it down and get your insight on it. But I truly appreciate your time and appreciate your expertise.
Ryan, you are a major figure in the industry as well, man. It's an honor to be on your show, and it's definitely an honor to have been on the podcast, and I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, man.